I will start recording. With that being the case, without any further ado, I call upon the Prime Minister to open the debate that stands in their name.
Okay, I assume that I can be heard. Fantastic. So, starting in 3, 2, 1. Distinguished panel, drag has always been an act of protest. It is an act of protest against the gender binary. It is an act of parody against the mainstream. And ever since a drag queen was one of the first ones to throw the stone at Stonewall, we tell you that it is a way of the gay community and the LGBT community to react against a world that doesn't want them in it. 3 things I'm going to be talking about. Firstly, about how when drag culture is part of the mainstream, appropriation becomes inevitable. Second, about why the commercialization of drag culture precludes criticism from mainstream society. And lastly, about how it also restricts expression of performers, which we see as incredibly important, given that this is a very unique LGBT way of expression. Firstly, before that, I just want to do a little bit of framing in this debate in regards to the kinds of things that we envision as being part of the mainstream. So by going mainstream, what we mean is that there is now a significant viewership coming from outside of the LGBT community and towards what we would traditionally consider like more mainstream culture. So think about all of your straight friends now commentating and watching RuPaul's Drag Race. Things like Netflix now having a show hosted by Trixie and Katya. Things like RuPaul Drag Race now being massively popular and people amongst like any sexuality in the United States watching it more. Queens in American Drag Race being much more polished and getting designer-made garments, etc. We acknowledge there is a trade-off, that when we become less mainstream, there's probably going to be less viewership, there's probably going to be less money, there's probably less awareness across the sexuality spectrum of what drag is. But we think that is fine. We don't think, however, that we have to defend a world in which all drag queens are broke, because there's probably still significant interest in drag within LGBT circles. So we think that it's not mainstream enough that it becomes completely unfeasible for you to be a drag queen or a drag performer. Okay, why is it that appropriation becomes inevitable? I think that the issue is that when you present drag in this very, very mainstream way, it's not just for individuals inside of the community, but also for individuals outside of it, who, although do not understand why certain expressions are being utilized, do end up utilizing them, feeling like they belong in the community. Think about how, for example, white individuals appropriating the African-American vernacular and starting to speak like that, even though they don't understand where that language comes from and the oppression that oftentimes comes with utilizing that language. In the same way, I think behaving as individuals do oftentimes in drag culture leads to you doing things that those people are doing precisely because it's a sort of way to hit back and rebel against a mainstream that tells them that you cannot act like this and cannot behave like this, and then using that despite the fact that they have the privilege to still behave in that way. I think this is important for three reasons. Firstly, it's because you infiltrate and appropriate that culture. At the end of the day, when drag spaces become full of straight people, it becomes much more difficult for example, to make jokes about the straights, because then the audience might get offended. It means that your voice becomes louder, and you think that you can speak for LGBT issues because I have seen all seasons of RuPaul's Drag Race. I definitely understand what being an LGBT person is like. And I think that that's less valuable to the extent that you crowd out other voices. Secondly, is that, and this is quite big, is that I think that the problem is that you expect all LGBT people that you meet to fit into that particular spectrum, right? The issue with something becoming mainstream is that it clouds out and excludes other modes of representation because there's a limit to how much television a person can watch, right? I think this is important because not all gay men that you meet are going to be like, yes, queen, do that death drop. But to the extent that a lot of people now expect them to act in this way, when someone doesn't fit into your particular notion of what being gay is like, then you think that that's weird, that that's not okay, that they don't belong in the community, that perhaps they're not even as understanding as you would be. I think the third thing is that it also leads to corporations being able to get away with not providing actual more LGBT representation. Things like Netflix hosting RuPaul's Drag Race allows them to be like, we're gay friendly, whereas in reality, the vast majority of their movies only feature LGBT plus individuals as side characters rather than as main characters, and they don't prominently feature LGBT storylines in many situations. I think the issue with all of this is that at the end of the day, appropriation becomes inevitable when you go mainstream. I think that a lot of these issues just wouldn't happen if it hadn't gone mainstream. Second issue, why is it that commercialization precludes criticism? I want to go back to what I started with in my introduction, right? That drag is a parody, and it is in many cases, or in all cases rather, an act of protest against a heavily enforced gender binary. You cannot do that anymore when you become part of the mainstream. I think this happens because when you become part of the mainstream, you need to firstly, joined that mainstream thought. And in order for you to even become popular within the mainstream, you need to be accepted by a lot of people. That means that then your criticisms cannot be pointed out to what a lot of people would find offensive. You're going to be less able to criticize, for example, things like the structure of marriage, if a lot of people in the audience are married and therefore feel personally offended. So that precludes your ability to be more mainstream, precludes your ability to provide valuable criticism. I think this is important because drag is one of the best ways, I think, that we have to criticize particular things like the gender binary, like what is feminine and masculine, like the blurring of those lines. But you become less able to do that when there's more and more pressure for drag queens to fit into particular molds. There's more pressure for them to, for example, look incredibly feminine, which is why if you look at the sort of progress of RuPaul's Drag Race, queens become more and more and more and more polished. They become more corseted, like skinnier over the course of seasons. And I think that that's dangerous at the extent that we lose the ability to criticize the mainstream. And then the mainstream thinks that everything is okay. The last thing that I want to talk about is how it also restricts expression within drag performers. I think there's two things that are important to mention here. Firstly, is that in order to be successful as a drag queen, when you're outside of the mainstream, there's nothing really that you need to sort of, I will take CEO actually before I go into this. CEO? Okay.
Trixie and Katya, arguably the most prominent comedians, are the ones who galvanized their support base by criticizing everything about straight culture.
I think it's true that they become, but I think that the issue is that, for example, Trixie and Katya spoke out about Taylor Swift being the equivalent of white mayonnaise like 3 years ago. I don't think they would do that now because they've gone more mainstream, precisely because now they have a show on Netflix, and Netflix would probably not be okay with them criticizing a bunch of their TV shows. In fact, they're frequently made to watch TV shows that they otherwise would have, criticized quite heavily. So I think that the more mainstream you become, the less you have the capacity to criticize. So why does it restrict expression? Because to be successful, you need to fit into what is in the idea of being mainstream, right? That means that overall, you're more likely to deliberately put yourself into one particular mold, but also you want to more deliberately appeal to the kinds of things that people in the mainstream are looking for. I think that means that as a performer, your mode of expression is restricted. When we already restrict the ways of expression that LGBT individuals have, we think that going mainstream is a mistake. At the end of the day, it restricts expression, it precludes our ability to criticize, and we think that it leads to the appropriation of a culture that has been criticized for too long for the mainstream. Very proud to oppose.
I thank the Prime Minister for a fine speech and now call upon the Leader of the Opposition to open the case for side op.
Hiya, can everybody hear me?
Yeah, you're audible.
The reason why LGBT people protest in the first place is because they desire to be included and they desire for their art to be recognized. I think that at the moment where that happens through commercialization and you have an increase in recognition and a decrease in stigmatization of drag performers, I think that is exactly in line with aims of protest. So I'm going to do a few things. Firstly, I'm going to prove to you why we are going to galvanize more economic benefits on our side of the house and therefore beating a lot of opening government's material purely based on the strength of impact, because even if appropriation does happen, that I think it is significantly more important and preferable for communities to have ways to provide for themselves, even if then there are some like optics benefits. And second, why this increases broader awareness of queer topics in general, and why we have better social impact on that side. So firstly, in terms of economic benefits, I think that how this looks like basically is firstly an increase increasing demand for drag-related content. So I think more people go, like in the first place, go to see drag shows, but second, you have like newer opportunities that you never would have had. So for example, you have like TV shows, not only RuPaul's Drag Race, but even stuff like Pose and stuff like Legendary that cover like the, the ballroom culture in NYC, but also a lot of stars, like drag stars, go into mainstream media and have the possibility to access stuff like modeling. So for example, Shea Coulee and Gigi Goode are now like models for like mainstream, like fashion houses, and that's massively beneficial for them in terms of capacity to provide for themselves, making ends meet. But also these are people that are prominent activists in their communities, and they're likely to take that money and spend it within their communities in terms of providing advocacy, but also providing support within their communities and stuff like that. In terms of who gets these opportunities, firstly, I think it's worth recognizing that this is a very diverse group of people off the bat. Yes, there is some sort of like incapacity for people that don't have like a maximum amount of like financial resources, but I also think it's worth noting that there are a lot of things that you can like make up for if you don't have a lot of money. So for example, if you have a great personality or an amazing sense of humor, you can look like Bianca Del Rio, who kind of doesn't have like the most sophisticated wardrobe, but is incredibly funny and can become popular off the basis of that. But I also like to say that just generally this is a very diverse group of performers that get these opportunities. Firstly, because creators and producers of these shows are very often POC and very often trans themselves, and therefore are likely to platform individuals that also represent the diversity of drag in itself. But second, I think that there is a large understanding, even within like the Gentile viewing audience, that drag did come out of like ballroom culture, and it was like spearheaded by like trans women, and therefore like that is something that they want to see reflected, even if they themselves aren't that. See the fact that, I don't know, the past 5 winners of Drag Race have all been like, POC and incredibly diverse. But second, I just think that this is much better than the comparative, right? I think on the comparative that OG have to stand behind is very, very small shows that literally nobody goes to, or very few people go to, where the same sort of like, like people being able to speak for queer movements like happens, but it's much like tinier, therefore much like harder to call out when people are like, using vernacular and stuff like that and claiming to have expertise, because this is not a widespread phenomenon. I think in the status quo, people make fun of people that say yes, queen, even though they're straight all the time. I don't think that's actually like anybody takes them seriously, even like within mainstream society. But I think what they do also have to stand behind is a comparative where it's much harder, where like, queens struggle to make ends meet. Like literally, like, I don't know, there are Trixie's vlogs as back as like 2010, where she talks about how she struggles to like buy like a good eyeshadow and like perform her drag. And even if this isn't about like making ends meet or whatever, it is about the capacity to properly express your art and the capacity to like properly like translate your persona, and therefore those harms also accrue, even I guess like on an artistic level, and stuff like that. Also on an economic point, I think that what the motion does is it makes the LGBT like community and LGBT art in general seem like a good investment, and this opens up opportunities not just for drag artists but for a lot of other entertainers. So see Pose having like 5 trans POC actors that became like community leaders, became like platformed, etc. I think that's a massive benefit for the community, but also for the LGBT movement as a whole, which is why I'm going to go into broad awareness of queer topics and why this is improved on our side of the house. I think firstly, more people just try drag, like more queer people like find out about drag. I just don't think that this is just a given that just because you're queer, like you already would have always known about drag. I think that a lot of people live isolated from it. I also think it's important for a lot of people that, like, I don't know, in Romania, there isn't even now, right, like a big like drag scene or whatever. So literally the only way in which like queer people from Romania can access drag is because it is commercialized, because there is like a TV show that you can buy across borders, right? I think that the accessibility of it in countries that are quite oppressive is very important because it allows self-discovery to happen on a large scale. Yes, I'm going to take a POI from CG before I move on.
So maybe it's true that some of the queens themselves are poorer, but mainstreaming still sets the standard to have fancy makeup and designer clothing, and poor people feel like they can never achieve that status and embody it in their daily lives.
So I think that the standard to a certain extent always occurs because you always judge people that have nicer clothes, like in comparison, like literally that's what ballroom is, right? Like people who have the fancy clothes are always the ones that are judged higher. So that standard always exists. But I think now there is a higher chance for people to get nice stuff and to actually actualize their dreams, which is what we stand behind. But secondly, I think that a lot of this commercialization provides education and provides larger awareness for the public, right? I think that the commercialization means that these things are entertaining, which means that a lot of, like, a broad base of people find this interesting, right? I think that the broad population is likely to empathize with a lot of these queens. So that's the first mechanism, right? Because they're famous, right? And because they're celebrities, you like them, and therefore you like understand the harms that they're going through much more than you would like, you know, a rando off the street, right? You empathize with them, and therefore you're much more likely to at least be sympathetic towards the harms that the LGBT community goes through. But also mainstreaming means that LGBT issues then garner like societal like credit and societal like capital in a way in which it couldn't previously, when they're seen as fringe and you know, like dressing up as a different gender is seen as something to be stigmatized, etc. And therefore it's much more likely to lead to acceptance. For all these reasons, I beg you to oppose.
I thank the leader of the opposition for a fine speech and now call upon the DPM to further this case to side gov.
Please POI me by turning on your videos and raising a hand. I'll also accept POIs if people unmute themselves and say POI, but I have a strong preference for just gesturing. A little bit of framing. 1, drag race and other content is likely to be only popular in circles where LGBTQ plus people are already recognized, because you already accept that this is a valid lifestyle, that these are other human beings as well. And that's why they're uncontroversial enough to be sponsored on camera. Therefore, the most important thing is not to declare to the world that trans people exist and that gay people exist, because this is all common knowledge, but rather to ensure that they're able to live equal lives. And I think that stigmatization is something that comes in many insidious forms, because to be told that I'm subhuman and immoral and promiscuous and disgusting strips me of my right to live a normal life, but so is being expected to act a certain way and being seen as a tool for someone else's entertainment and as inhumanly chipper, camp, all of those different kinds of things that make you feel like you're not really being seen for who you really are. I think for those reasons, OO's best case scenario of mass exposure does more harm than good. 3 things in the speech. First, concluding our impacts. Second of all, weighing them to explain why they're the most important issue in the round. And finally, cleaning up OO and debate and defeating the best form of their case. So first, what's her biggest impact? It is that drag culture becomes appropriated. There's very little response to Lucia's analysis about commercialization, about how this restricts the spectrum of things you can say. There's next to no response about why it's really, really bad when straight people walk up and say that this is my turf now. I'm just gonna add a little bit to explain why this appropriation is inevitable. And it's not just straight people participating, but it's them claiming ownership for 2 reasons. The first is because I think even when the straight people watching are benign, because I think it's reasonable to suggest that if you're watching RuPaul's Drag Race, that you're not hugely homophobic, that it's probably true that people have a strong desire to feel a sense of connection to the things that they watch and consume. That's why there's so much obsession about whether you're a true fan of various underground metal bands, for example, but it's also why so many people try to adopt African-American vernacular, not because they're trying to do any harm, but because they respect the performers and want to interpret and be similar to them. And I think this is also likely to be true because there's a strong profit incentive for producers and TV shows to also encourage this, just because even if individual performers are reluctant to change the way they behave or allow or make compromises for straight viewers, it's often the case that there's harsh profit competition, where if you choose not to bring these viewers in, someone else is going to corner your market. And I think the reason, and I think what this takes the form of is things such as having collective names for fans, selling merchandise to make people feel like they've bought like loyalty and a successful claim to a position within these things. So I think what I've proven so far is that as this mainstreaminess goes on and on, I think the sense of collective identity spreads out beyond gay people who watch this because it reminds them of their own life experience and because it's generally empowering for them, and to straight people who watch it for entertainment and yet feel like they have a say in what it looks like. Why is this so bad and the most important impact in the round? The first is because it generally changes the way in which you treat people, because it means that people feel like the average gay person is feminine, and for example, to say that just because of your sexuality, your gender as masculine is also less true and less valid, for example. Why is that true? It's true because I think drag is likely to drown out other forms of sexual expression because it's much, much more labeled as this is about the queer experience. This is uniquely for gay people, for example, but also because it's so loud and so noticeable and so easy to market and eye-catching. But second of all, I also want to say that this is also true and it's even more insidious than other forms of media about gay people, because the point of drag is about transformation. People find a sick fascination in how a person that you'd see on the street can transform through the use of makeup, costume, behavior, body language into an alien who's incredibly visible. I think the implication is that any gay person that you meet has this side to them and owes you a performance to behave in this way. It's exhausting when someone walks up to you and cracks an in-joke, expecting you to get the reference and acting kind or give them the payout that they're expecting because they consume so much of this media. It's exactly the same kind of thing that comes at you as soon as you're shown to be different. I think that's actually more important than all claims about acceptance, because fine, in their worst case scenarios, some conservative and some centric people are still going to be dicks to you, but one, that's incredibly obvious to you, and you can do things to just censor the way you act because you know that they're a danger to you. On the other hand, when the average ally decides that this is how you ought to behave, that also means that your safe spaces, the places where you feel like you should be yourself, are now exhausting, emotionally intensive, and somewhere where you feel like you don't belong because you're not seen and respected for a human being in the same way. But second of all, it's also harmful because it means that straight people try to explain things on your behalf because they want to seem woke, which means that they're very, very likely to just recommend it to their friends. Why is this really problematic? Because I think that straight people are just unable to appreciate and understand drag in the same way that we do. Because whereas we recognize that it's ultimately critical and about parody and about the oppression that we still continuously face, it looks to an outsider looking in as something that's just lighthearted and camp, and sellers also make it designed such that it looks that way. That's really, really bad because that undermines efforts for it to show that the continuous experience that we're feeling, despite the fact we have pride parades, despite the fact that we try in our safe spaces to seem loud and proud, that we're ultimately doing just fine. And it's less important to trade off against other rights in order to protect us. And I think that's really, really harmful. So I think that these are probably the most important issues in the round, especially stuff about performance, because drag is an art form. It's really, really bad if you push it into a certain mold, like the same way as forcing all women to write about love, because that's what men expect them to do is. And I think that's a strong reason to vote vote OG. Okay, so I don't think that the OO case is super strong, to be honest, which is why I'm only spending a minute on it. So on earning money, few responses. One, most nightclubs don't pay well and never will. The reason for this is because there's a large number of performers. You're not just competing for drag, you're competing with other strippers, with other singers, which means that pay is often very, very low. Two, even if it comes to those massive deals like stars from RuPaul's Drag Race, the benefits are often extremely slim. One, because it's very arbitrary, but two, it corresponds with privilege, such as being physically attractive, for example, being trained and wealthy enough to have gone to performance school in the past. But finally, I just think it does more harm than good, even if it gets money, in the same way that we don't support Candice Owens, even though she probably is quite wealthy. Okay, so why then do we beat exposure? First, because I think most queer people are going to be connected enough to see these shows because, you know, people share things with each other. But if they don't, they probably live in very isolated conservative communities, and drag races are not the best place to introduce them to things. But second of all, it's the case that stigma changes. Even if you're not being stigmatized for being different, you're being stigmatized for being camp, for being feminine, for being hyperactive, and being fundamentally different from everyone else. So for those reasons, not all exposure is good exposure. We're very happy to propose.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for a fine speech and now call upon the DLO to further this case of side op.
Okay, can you all hear me?
Yeah, you're audible.
If I had like a visual thing, but I should try and take one before 6 minutes anyway. Either way, so yes. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to go through the entirety of OG's case in order because I think, and then the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to do it comparatively because I think like what they do bring is like real genuine harms that probably do manifest to some extent in the real world. But I think the point is that you're making a trade-off at every single point, and I think they never weigh off the trade-offs, which compared to what Julie gives you at each point, and I'm going to do that now. So I think the first thing that they talk about is like, you're always going to get appropriation, and this comes in several forms. Because first of all, you get like straight people or like so-and-so called allies being like trying to speak over gay people and trying to like erase LGBT voices and try to talk about it. And I agree, that's probably bad, and it's a really annoying thing when someone who's not actually part of your group tries to talk about it on your behalf. But I think what is important here is the comparative, because on our side, at least now, you have these people who are involved and they are so invested and they love these like characters and queens and individuals so much that they want to defend them and they want to try and like be activists for their rights, right? Even if they do it in the wrong way, they have very good intentions. The comparative then is that when it's not mainstream, they don't know these people exist. I think in the best case scenario then, even if they're not like openly homophobic, which yeah, probably is unrealistic, they just say they're nothing. They don't call out, they do not actively go and try and like, they don't vote for politicians based on their LGBT policies. They don't do any of these things. But I think then that like, that's the best case scenario is they do nothing. But I think the worst case scenario is that actually like people and drag queens are so much more stigmatized because they're not used to seeing them, because it is not in the mainstream media and you've never even heard of these things possibly before. I think when you do see them or you do hear about them, you think this is a really weird thing and you immediately oust them because like you think they're very different from you and this is something that you've never come across before. And so then you immediately feel like a fear or whatever from that. So I think comparatively that is a much worse harm. And I think you're much more likely to be like hurt or called out on the street compared to at least on our side when they have good intentions. And I think like also this problem is so easily like dealt with, right? You can just so easily re-educate these people because I think all of these queens or people or prominent activists in the LGBT community could quite easily point out these mistakes and be like, well, look, we realize you were trying to do something good, but it is not okay to do these things. And I think if they like are genuine fans as much as like that we all claim as like they are, I think they're going to listen to these people because they have enormous amounts of influence. Cool. I think that the next thing they talk about is like you expect all LGBT people to look like this and fit like this and be in this like box that you put them in as you've seen them on TV, which is in a very commercialized setting. I think first of all, people are rational and they know TV personalities exist. Like look at Desperate Housewives or any other reality TV show or Big Brother or anything like that. Everyone knows that the average person in the world does not act like that, and people are specifically chosen to go on these shows because they are like extra but dramatic, or they have a flair, or they're going to cause some drama or something like that. And I think people can rationally then like identify and like they have like the cognitive ability to separate both like a TV personality and then an actual person, especially if it's LGBT person. I also think if this person isn't like homophobic because they're watching RuPaul's Drag Race, I don't think they're going to make such mass broad generalizations. I think they're going to be much more aware of this because again, if you love these queens and stuff like that, you probably likely follow them social media and stuff like that. You see them hanging out with other friends who might not be drag queens and stuff like that. And I think you can see how people are different and like there's just like a wide range of this. But I also think that like drag is just not the only way that like straight people interact with the LGBT community, right? I think you see gay people all the time in different TV shows, even if they are sideline characters and they don't act like this at all. And I think people just know that you have a range of identities in that. I think last of all about like, oh, corporations get to piggyback on this and this is not good, even if they don't actually have, like they get good LGBT representation, even though this is not the case, which directly clashes with what Julie brings you. Because I think then like weighing this off, then I think this is just okay because you get the economic benefits for the individuals. The PM at the beginning of their speech immediately goes, yes, we are going to take the trade-offs if you have less awareness and less money. And I don't know why this is more important for like compared to the actual queens themselves who go out and would on comparative be so much poorer or would not have this job at all. When this means for them is that first of all, they either have like all the economic disadvantages that Julia's already talked about, but it also means that they cannot themselves indulge or like express their art form in the way that they want to, or like be who they want to in real life, or they cannot like at least like live that way because it is not profitable. I think then commercialization lets a lot of people to come into this industry and do this thing. I think then like the next thing they talk about, oh, it precludes criticism, because if you're talking about the mainstream, you can't make like straight people jokes and stuff like that. But I think you very easily can, because the mechanisms they give to this is because the producers who want to keep it mainstream are likely to be like, no, we can't do that, that's too spicy or controversial or whatever. But I think this is incredibly likely to do so, because first of all, Julia already tells you that most of the people who work on these shows are also like people of color or people within the LGBT community, so they're likely to be open to the idea. But then secondly, I think then also like companies are also very scared of backlash. I think it is quite easy then if someone or an artist wants to do something or discuss a topic or be critical of of something and the company says, no, this is not okay, because they have such a large following on Twitter and stuff like that, I think you're very easily to point this out and be like, look, this company didn't let us do this. I think that even if you are dropped by a TV show or something like that, because this is so mainstream and there's so much demand for this content in media, you're very likely to be picked up by another producer or TV show broadcasting thing anyway. So because it is mainstream specifically. Whereas I think on the comparative, like if you are doing, like, even if it isn't a smaller thing and you can do your own things, it doesn't matter if you can discuss their own things and be critical about things like marriage or whatever you want to talk about, if no one can see or no one is there to actually watch that show and actually hear your criticisms about it. Like, criticism into the void doesn't get any social progress or any change, right? I think then last of all, it restricts performers because you have to fit into an idea. But I think the entire selling point of drag is that it was radical. And so unlike something that is very traditional, being the same for many years on POW, it's so much more difficult to change that because this is just how it's always been. I think the fact that drag literally had such a radical origin and has continued to be that means that it is always looking for new things, but also just on a monetary term as to why this is likely to happen and you are likely to get more radical ideas, is that because people are always looking for something new in the media, because things get repetitive and people get bored and want to move on. And so to stand out, especially in this hyper competitive market where there's so much competition in terms of TV shows, not just in the drag scene, for example, you're always going to want to be finding a new edge in some niche in the market. Yeah, I'll take a point from CG.
You have to be watching drag shows in order to be affected by their preeminence in the mainstream.
No, okay. So this is the point, right? Rebuilding then on Julie's stuff what's it called, contact theory and stuff like that, and the commercialization for the public, right? Look, my mom has never, ever watched a drag show. I actually haven't either. I'm one of the few queer people who's never watched RuPaul's Drag Race or anything along those lines. But obviously I know about it because I'm queer. But people like my mom and my dad who have never ever engaged in this or are both really straight know about drag queens and things like that because it just tops up now. There's been radio shows about it, or there's just been mentions of it on mainstream TV shows that they all watch. It comes up on the news. It comes up in other mainstream media when they make references to other things outside of that. It is only because drag specifically does this that it is so important. And I think this is where the contact theory comes in again, right? Because I think this is why you get more social progress on our side and the destigmatization and the world as larger, because everyday people, even if they have ideas of the LGBT community, now drag specifically is less stigmatized because it is now mainstream and it trickles down into other forms of media when people reference it back, how everybody knows Hamilton and Game of Thrones references even if you've never seen it because it is such a mainstream thing. And I think that is how then even other people are able to engage in this and then destigmatize it for society as a whole. So proud to oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for a fine speech and now call upon the Member of Government to further the case for side gov. Can
everyone hear me? Okay.
Yeah, you're audible.
All right. Starting, POIs in the chat, please. Starting in 3, 2, 1. OO spends a lot of time talking about the impacts to queens themselves. This is 2% of the population of gay people. I don't see why we care. What we're going to do from closing government is we're going to explain how drag shapes the way that LGBT people are seen in broader society. And specifically, we're going to do this in a way that is tailored specifically to the impact of social change and LGBT activist movements becoming more successful. We think that for all of the reasons that Emma told you in response to Kat's POI, media is profound in shaping how ordinary people view LGBT people, both on a conscious and an instinctual level. And specifically the impacts that we're going to get that are vital for social change are: 1, changing the minds of conservatives, getting them to stop resisting change, stop voting against it, stop coming out to counter protests, and 2, things that will spurn liberals to action. Because OG just says that liberals have a bad image of LGBT people, but they don't fully impact this. We're going to tell you why it makes it harder for LGBT people to get their rights when liberals have the specific image of LGBT people that comes from drag. I want to quickly weigh this against OG before I get into substantively proving this. So OG talks a lot about how LGBT people are seen and their ability to express themselves, they're limited to drag expression by straight liberals. But I think what we're going to prove is more important to this than this, because we're going to prove things like getting more employment protections, getting more things like hate crime laws that actually protect these people, getting things like sex education in schools that teaches children about what it means to be LGBT so that they're exposed to it in a positive context. So this means that what we're doing is more important than what opening government is doing, because even if opening government is right and in Gov's world you are more able to express yourself when you're free from this free from this burden of living up to a drag queen, it is still the case that without broader social change, you still have a lot of trouble expressing yourself because you can't do that in a society that's dangerous to you, where people hate you, and in a society where you have no money to spend money on whatever you want to express yourself because you can't get a job. Moreover, I think what we're going to say is more important than what OG says about drag being used for protest and how that's impossible in Ops World, because OG never explains what this protest does. They never explain why it's so important that drag can be used to protest against the system. That's not really where our impacts are going to be. Okay, so I want to briefly rebut what opening opposition says about how, oh, this like leads to more acceptance of LGBT people because like, you know, the benefits spill over and like everyone sympathizes with them now. So I think there are a couple things. I think firstly, this needs to be the right kind of representation in order to do that. What we're going to prove in extension is that not just any kind of representation will do. But the other thing to say is that this is just profoundly non-comparative because there is lots of other media that features LGBT people. Like it's not just drag queens. This impact can be gotten through things like San Junipero or Call Me By Your Name. But what I do want to prove is that drag tends to crowd out like other forms of LGBT media and tends to be the only way that people think of LGBT people when it exists in the mainstream. This is true because one, it just stands out and gets more attention because it's so outlandish and flashy, whereas it's like hard to like put like Call Me By Your Name or something on like the cover of a magazine. It's just not as attention grabbing because it's like not as bright and outlandish. And secondly, unlike like stories about normal people, which is probably the comparative that we're defending, is like the way that straight people get their image of LGBT people is from stories about them just like living their lives and being fairly normal people. Unlike those stories, drag is exclusive to LGBT people. So if it exists in the mainstream, it is more formative to how you see LGBT people. Whereas on our side of the house, without drag to crowd it out, you get stories like as I said, San Junipero and Call Me By Your Name, where gay people are just kind of like existing as normal people who happen to who happen to be LGBT. So with that framing out of the way, let's get into why this image of that drag creates of LGBT people is horrible for gay acceptance. And I'm going to do this in two ways. Firstly, I'm going to talk about creating sympathy for LGBT people. And secondly, I'm going to talk about how drag makes it look like there's no need to help LGBT people. So firstly, with regards to sympathy, and I think this is crucial to get conservatives on side, to get them to stop protesting us, to stop voting against our rights, but also just crucial for LGBT people who have to interact with straight conservatives because they're like in their family or go to their school or something. The first thing to say is that you can't really sympathize with drag queens in the way that OO describes, because drag queens are kind of about being a little bit inhuman. They're kind of about being godly and unrelatable. This is not something that you can come to identify with, even if it permeates the culture, whereas the comparative is that a struggle for identity, which is what most other LGBT media focuses on, is a much more relatable and marketable thing because it is a fairly universal experience to not be sure who you are and to want to know who you are. This is something that people can sympathize with far more. But the second thing to say is that drag is a very scary outcome to conservative people in a way that being a fairly normal gay person isn't. Like it's like, you know, drag queens are kind of these like freaky, like I don't want to like use too much insulting language, but conservatives see them as like freaky, like out there things that are like way anti-family and go against all of their values. Whereas it's a lot easier for a conservative to come around to their gay son being just like a perfectly normal guy who happens to be into men. I think that this translates to action by conservatives for things like opposing LGBT sex education in schools because you become afraid of your kids being exposed to gay people, whereas that's not the case if you see them as fundamentally normal people, which is the comparative that we get. Second point, I'm really sorry I don't have time to take a POI. I managed my time badly. The second point is that this makes it look like there is no need to help LGBT people. And this applies to like moderates and liberals and explains why even if liberals feel sympathy for drag queens, as OO says, even if we were to concede that, it doesn't actually translate to action. Three things to say. Firstly, there is a narrative, especially among moderates, that in Ops World, media is pandering to even the most outlandish gay people. Like if they can get drag queens on TV, which is like something that would have been impossible 20 years ago, then they must not have any problems anymore, and society must be broadly accepting. This narrative is a lot less likely in our world when media isn't pandering to the most outlandish gay people. This is a narrative that means that moderates feel like there's no need to come out in support, and it means that they don't do things like join protests or actively vote in favor of our rights. Second thing is that drag is associated with celebration, that it is like something that's fun, it's like a party, meaning that when LGBT people protest, protest, they're like ruining the fun when this is the image you have of them. You associate them with things that make you feel good and feel happy. But like learning about the ways that homophobia and transphobia work are kind of depressing. And so you don't want to hear that anymore. The comparative is that in our world, most media will focus on the suffering of these people and like focus on the ways that homophobia and transphobia work so that dissonance doesn't happen when they start to protest. And thirdly, it makes LGBT people look rich because you can see that they're wearing lots of makeup and designer clothing. This contributes to the harmful myth about LGBT people, which is that they are like really rich and don't need help as a result of that. Again, the comparative is that on our side of the house, when they're just portrayed as normal people, there's no particular reason to have that image. Having social change, having people who are on our side and willing to fight for that change is a fundamental prerequisite to any kind of expression, meaning that our extension is a fundamental prerequisite to everything that happened in Top Half. Propose.
I thank the member of Gov for fine speech and now call upon the member of Opt further the case for side op.
Cool, can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Cool, thank you. Just a second. All right. So this is my show. I'm gonna talk about whatever I want. So few things. First of all, appropriation, how it actually works. Second of all, drag queens as a mothers of LGBTQ community and how we need to necessarily put them on that fucking pedestal in order for them to be seen, in order for them to tell the stories of people who were not able to tell the stories in the first place. Third of all, about the expectation, and this is the last point that CG had in this debate, because essentially that they are saying that Call Me By Your Name and San Junipero, that is beautiful actors who fit in cis stereotype modes, are the representation that we want to see amongst LGBT community, and we want to be perceived via this expectation. Completely false. Yes, I want to be applied to the fucking stereotype of being a freak, of being Laganja, of being Gia Gunn, of everyone like that. Because if we don't have the full expectation of you being okay with that, we don't have acceptance at all. The thing that makes the LGBTQ movement the most complacent is when the cis gays are getting their rights to marry, but trans people, gender non-binary people are effectively shut down, because the only thing that Netflix wanted to portray before the drag queens went mainstream were exactly Call Me By Your Name, two gay cis guys who are basically very beautiful and having the fucking romantic story. This is not how our movement is supposed to be about. We don't like the fact that we are shut down in those specific movies from the chunks of the LGBTQ history that we deserve to be seen in mainstream. We deserve to have that represented, right? Couple of comparatives still on that. Note how specifically beautiful people in the movies that Gwen talks about are specifically the people who it's hard for us to aspire to, right? Because they have very rigid gender expression that is usually the cis one. Note that for much of the cis people within the LGBTQ movement, it's much more easier to come out or accept themselves rather than to people who are effectively shut down and seen as less because they don't look particularly feminine when they're supposed to look feminine according to the mainstream. So at the point at which we are able to, at least for liberals, to sort of broaden the range of what expectation of LGBTQ people we can have, this is very good. Second of all, body types, ginger mint, pork chop being our absolute icons when it comes to plus size queen, and being there, even with sometimes busted makeup, still making us laugh, still making us learn something about the queer history. This is effectively far more better than Timothée Chalamet having his like star moment, earning millions of dollars and never talking about the LGBT community and never talking about the experiences that are very important, and shutting down the voices that's supposed to be heard about our history, about our struggles in the mainstream media. When it comes to two things, first, appropriation, how it actually works, and second, as drag queens, as mothers of the community. First, appropriation. Note, the whole debate got it wrong. Appropriation started since drag started. Fashion houses has been stealing from us from years and years without giving us credit, without saying that the camp was actually invented by the fucking drag queens, without voguing being ever credited to the ballroom, but rather to Madonna, about disco music being credited to the general audience when we were the ones who first gave it the spin, when we were experimental with the music, when we were experimental about art. No more changes. At least we are getting credit. At least we can tell the story about the looks. At least we can actually come out and earn money. At least we can support our local queens and local people who are on the ground and getting credit for that and being seen finally as a people who are worthy, as people who are great designers, great seamstress and things like that. This specific representation is the one that we need, because we need to show clear queer excellency, right? That we are not only good and normal people, but we can excel at stuff, and that historically we've been shut down from. And by the fact that drag queens can capture that attention because of how controversial they are, how funny they are, and things like that, this makes so much more for our appreciation of the drag art and allows us to cherish those economical benefits or the credit rights or the representation rights for us all. Third of all, the sort of general representation. Note that they are telling that drag loses its protest value. Got Meg as a contestant of season 13, as a trans man portraying as a drag feminine woman is potentially the most like fuckable gender expression that you can give to straights. Sure, it wasn't as rough as season 1 is, right? It's much more polished because Godmake has money and things like that. But still, this was pretty clear example of gender fuckery and how we actually can show to everyone that we are not able to sort of just be pushed down and be complacent with the roles that they are signing to us, because we are keep pushing those boundaries. Note that Godmake specifically galvanized the support and the acceptance that we didn't have in the first place in the LGBTQ movement, because for many of us, we didn't even know that those people exist, right? Gia Gunn, Jiggly Caliente being trans contestants and still impersonating females. These are very important to know and in order to be educated and to have a knowledge of what type of representation we can have and the most representation in the first place. Last of all, drag queens as the mothers in the drag community. Note that the ones who are rising to the prominence are very often the ones that have years of legacy, years of polishing their drag, years of having experience within the community. Note also that person who does drag and goes mainstream with it potentially is after the step of going through hardship in their personal life, of being okay with who they come out as and things like that. Note that these specific people are the best spokespeople we can have in the community, because they are likely pay their dues in local clubs, listening to the young queer folks, giving them advices and things like that. Second of all, they experience a lot, right? The fact that they were actively so proud of the protests, the fact that they were leading the pride parades, the fact that they have an enormous amount of experience with working with other queens and things like that, makes them perfect representation and perfect spokespeople for that. Sure, it will not be perfect, but still we are able to get people who actually know the history of queer folks, who can actually show it to the public without with every single expression that they are doing. For all those reasons, I beg you to oppose.
I thank the member of opposition for fine speech and now call upon the government whip to further the case side gov. Hair.
Hey, can you hear me well?
Yeah, you're audible.
Thank you. 3, 2, 1. A couple of observations about opening government's case. One, on appropriation. I think you're the average informed voter that is judging this. The average informed voter, perhaps at this point in debating, has an intuition that appropriation is somewhat bad, but they don't finish the impact of this principle. I have no idea why they actually care about it to any degree beyond what opening government actually explicitly says. I think they pretty much just say it is bad because it is appropriation, not why appropriation is structurally harmful. Secondly, on less criticism of the gender binary, I have no idea why there is a meaningful benefit that is lost. I agree there is less criticism of that, and I would like that criticism to exist because I think it's academically interesting. But beyond its academic interest, interestingness. I have no idea why people internalize that criticism or why they act upon it in a different way. I don't see why it's useful. Thirdly, with regard to restricted expression, I'm unsure why you're otherwise heard, at which point, yes, you are probably restricted in what you can say, but I don't, again, see what the significant loss benefit of that is. I think one additional observation on the stuff of you crowd out other kinds of media. I think we are not contingent on X-Gays material for this because one, while they have one mechanism for it, which is that it's showy and noticeable, I think Gwen at the very least has one parallel and also a better mechanism, that it is something that you can uniquely apply to LGBT people, at which point all the benefits that we derive from it separately means that we're not contingent on opening government for those, so you should credit us for them independently. Now let's do specific weighing. I have 3 weighings against opening government. A, at the point we're going to characterize to you specifically what the counterfactual is, namely what kind of alternative media people consume and why specifically that shapes their perceptions differently. That means that the perception, why other perceptions can actually become more positive. I think that is meaningfully more important than just less exposure, because less exposure is something that I think is ultimately neutral. I think better exposure, and specifically exposure to things that better change people's mind and make them treat concretely the gay and trans people in their lives with more respect, is more significant than a couple of liberal people not holding mildly annoying opinions. But second, I think in terms of specifically the kind of imposition of stereotype and dehumanization that results from that, I think we just access this at a much more A, broader and B, more pernicious level. Why is that? Because I think the well-intentioned straight people that opening government talks about that come away from this with attitudes that are annoying and that appropriate LGBT struggle ultimately are probably, for a couple of reasons, less important than the people that Gwen talks about. A, they are more open to criticism, which means they are more likely to change their behavior. Secondly, they are probably less radical in terms of how they treat people around them. Thirdly, I think they are less likely to be disruptive to the experience of LGBT people around them at the most fundamental level, i.e. it's probably not your parents that are telling you that that are scared that if they allow you to wear nail polish, that will eventually turn you into someone that can't go home to your grandmother. I think that means that yes, you probably have some degree of annoyance if your straight friends are a little bit of a pain in your ass, but I think it's significantly worse if people that have no otherwise reason to treat LGBT people with meaningful amount of respect are now given an additional reason to treat them worse. I think that is something that's incredibly damaging, that is significantly more important. Lastly, with regard to political capital and the fact that, things just look fine. There's a couple of lines on this in DPM analysis, in DPM speech. However, I think the analysis that Gwen provides you specifically on how perception translates into action, as opposed to just saying, oh, you trade this off with other rights, is A, it translates into people seeing significantly more urgency for things like voting for LGBT protections, for funding services that help people that are marginalized, and for conservatives not treating not shutting down their gay kid. I think those are the kinds of things that massively more materially empower LGBT people to themselves become parts of movements and shape acceptance. I think at the point where you have a gay kid in a conservative community actually accepting that and living that reality, they have massive amounts of signaling power to make that community better, because the people there still love them. But in order to access that, they first have to actually be able to live that and be comfortable with it. I think that is massively more likely proven in Gwen's speech. I think this is more important as a result of that than the specific interactions that happen in areas that are broadly speaking pro-LGBT anyway, and will probably never treat LGBT people absolutely horribly, at which point the difference that we achieve and the people that we help is much more important, because those people are more vulnerable and they are significantly better treated. Let's talk about closing opposition then. I think closing opposition in terms of rebuttal, in terms of storytelling and platforming, maybe Timothy Chalamet is a dick, but I think that probably we can platform other LGBT people who are not that and who will in fact talk about LGBT stories. I think who will be in local organizations and who will support people there. I have no idea why you specifically need these people to do it. But secondly, with regard to at least getting credit for appropriation, A, this is opening opposition. Secondly, it's probably only very few people who actually get the benefit from that credit. Thirdly, I don't know why credit matters at the point where substantive changes are probably things that affect more people more widely. Thirdly, I think the access that to the standards of drag culture that are currently set by the commercialized drag culture actually make it meaningfully less successful for people to still participate in it, at which point at best credit is symmetric, because yes, maybe you get credit for it as part of a group, but you don't get to participate in the joy of that credit, at which point I don't see why people care. Let's reconstruct against their case, and then I'll take a point of information from opening opposition. Don't worry, guys. Okay, I think the stuff on, other representation is just pretty, and we would actually prefer to have outlandish representation because otherwise there isn't true acceptance. The reason why drag was able to become mainstream is because there was demand and will for diversity. That means that the counterfactual isn't like just like pretty white people. I think it is like there was mainstream demand for like stories of people that were different. I think that means that the empowering stories that we get that relate more to people in terms of how they explore gender diversity are also likely to feature people of color and to question beauty standards. I think the point is that just that they're likely to do it significantly better in terms of how they reach out to people who aren't yet on board, because those stories are relatable to people who aren't yet LGBT activists. The drag races are not, however, they crowd it out and they make you less likely to engage with other LGBT media, because if you think that that is it, you think you could never relate to it, which means you don't actually watch Sandra Junipero and don't get the benefits of that. That is the problem. Opening up, go.
So the art that you get about LGBT people is always going to be outrageous and flashy and deviant by your own analysis. So the comparative is not Call Me By Your Name, it is stereotypical deviant sidekick, and then the conservatives are always free to make up their own stereotypes about queer people.
No. I have no idea what analysis of ours you're referring to. I think the notion that you make media that resonates with a lot of people because it talks about like common human experiences, like hiding your identity and coming to terms with it, significantly more likely for a variety of reasons. That art is better, that creates better exposure. Let's talk about opening opposition. One, reconstruction against their preemptive of, not all gay people are this. Subconsciously you don't, because subconsciously your image is still formed by those things, because your subconscious expectation is formed by what is the first thing that comes to your mind. But secondly, oftentimes it specifically applies to people who don't know other out people. So their response is effective against opening government about like bunches of liberals who maybe know a bunch of gay and trans people, but it's not effective against people who don't know a lot of people who are out to them, who don't like typically watch a lot of LGBT media, because their perception is very effectively shaped by this. And also that perception makes them likely to be the kind of people who their gay kids aren't willing to come out to because they're scared of that, right? That specifically means that those people have their images shaped by this. On access, this is hard to emulate. This is hard to find joy in at the point where it's so far removed from your life. Empathy and outreach, Gwen is explicitly rebuts already. I don't think I have to do it again in WHIP, at which point, CG.
I thank the Gov Whip for fine speech and now call upon the opposition whip to conclude the case for side op and the debate as a whole.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Awesome, just give me a second. Okay. 3, 2, 1. I think Matti brought you 3 very important points in this debate. Broadly, we on Closing Opposition talked about representation, appropriation, and stories you're gonna hear when drag actually becomes and is mainstream. But before I come to that, let me rebut basically every other argument that was in this debate, starting with opening government. So what they're saying on opening government is they're first of all saying that you're going to be self-restricting drag. You're not going to make jokes that you want to make. You're not going to talk about problems that you want to talk about, right? We say to you that is first of all not true. Probably when you watch the Netflix show that they're referring to of Katya and Trixie trashing Too Hot to Handle, that is probably the best straight people trashing I've ever seen in my entire life. This is probably true, a little bit restricted maybe compared to what they would have done in clubs, but on comparative, they do not have that at all, right? So when they want straight people bashing, if there is a team that gives you straight people bashing, that's probably on the opposition house, right? Because note, as I say, they completely miss the comparative, because the comparative is not good bashing, and I don't know, straight people suddenly coming to a realization that they're not maybe the greatest in the world, but that is no bashing, and straight people living in their fantasy continuously. On second point, how therefore people act towards you and expect you to be the flamboyant gay. Two responses to that. First of all, Matti says to you, cool, I probably want that, and I probably want that me being a very polished version of myself when I have to restrict any part of flamboyant gay I have in myself, and I have to be what society expects of gay men when they're just gay, and that's it, and nothing besides the fact that they I don't know, hold hands in their private homes with another man or anything like that, right? This is first of all better, because this means that what drag in the mainstream is pushing you to do is probably pushing you to accept more. I will take OG in pushing you to accept more. Right? Second of all, I really don't think that it's really happening at all. Like, people who would generalize will generalize anyway, no matter if it will be generalization about drug culture or generalization about call me by your name, whatever. So I think this is also missing the comparative, right? And lastly, on appropriation, and I think this is the best point and the most important part of analysis that Matty brings you, especially compared to OG, because for OG, appropriation and this commodification of drug culture is a very bad thing without really explanation why this is so bad. Matty says to you, yes, that's probably bad, but that becomes okay at the point when appropriation change into appreciation, and this change when people who actually invented the things are getting recognized for that. So when Shea Coulee is on the cover of Vogue, that means that she's being recognized for the input into fashion that she had. When Gigi Goode is also on the cover of US Vogue, this means that the drug culture is finally being recognized of the for the input into culture that they had for years. This is the first time it's happening. It hasn't been happening before, and appropriation of drug culture started with disco in the 70s and continued through years and years and years, and this is the first time those queens are finally getting recognized, finally earning money for that, etc. Taking OG now if you have questions.
Generalization is not born of malice, but of accepting the story that producers feed audiences. The reason why being misjudged as a cartoon for straight entertainment is the most important impact in the debate is because this is about the most relevant group this debate is about to change. Not conservatives, but well-meaning straight people who interact with queer people on a daily basis and control their quality of life.
Sure, and I say to you, if people are generalizing, they would probably be generalizing anyway. I don't see that how suddenly a bigger group of people is generalizing because they saw Gigi Goode or Shea Coulee or anyone like that. I don't think this is happening. People who would generalize would probably generalize anyway. Okay, coming to CG, they are saying two things. They're saying, first of all, you as a conservative are more likely to accept your kids because you don't watch Drag Race, and I don't know, call me by your name, the name representation is better. We say to you two things. First of all, even before drag culture went into the mainstream, if you watch conservative media, what conservative media did is took the most outrageous parts of Pride Parade and show you the day before Pride Parade to make sure your kid will not go there. I don't think this is something that particularly changes, right? And suddenly because drag is in the mainstream, you are getting, I don't know, particularly more. As a conservative, this is probably the same messaging that you're getting and you would get anyway, right? So we don't think this is something that is changing. What they also say, listen about struggles, right? You don't want to hear about struggles because gay people are for your entertainment. We say to you, oh my God, like if Call Me By Your Name or anything of gay media before wasn't for your entertainment, where is Call Me By Your Name talking about struggles? It's Italy in the 70s, it's romance, no struggles there. Like life just seems to be perfect. The first time you actually hear about struggles, and when I'm sorry to hear it, but my straight cis boyfriend heard about gay people's struggles is when we watched RuPaul's Drag Race and Cynthia Fontaine and people were talking about people that they lost in Orlando shooting. When suddenly you hear that every single drag queen there had an awful struggle behind her and had an awful story of being either of like very violent things happening to them, being in active shootings, and I don't want to name all of that. You get the gist, right? This is the first time you hear them talking about struggles. Matty also says that to you. Listen, drag queens are the best people to talk about struggles because they have the most struggles, because they have been like the most outrageous and out there part of LGBTQ community. So they have the most struggles behind them. They have also built this community and they understand the struggles of the most people in this community. If this community wants to have representation, this is the representation that this community should have, because they are much more vocal than Neil Patrick Harris, so that, or Ellen DeGeneres, so the representation that the queer culture had before. We love the mainstreamization of drag because this means that Latrice Royale, a black big drag queen is coming onto Family Feud with RuPaul and being there. This is amazing. This has not happened 5 years ago and would not happen if RuPaul's drag race and drag culture hasn't gone into the mainstream. For all of these reasons, we are the first team that thought about how representation should look like and why is it the best representation, why appropriation is finally changing into appreciation on our side of the house. I think there's no other way to say that CEO wins this debate. For all these reasons, thank you, and thank you to oppose.